am so glad that you are here. I am Polly Buxton. My husband Julian and I, Julian is in the back, have the privilege of having this independent bookstore in our hometown. It is a labor of love, and one of the reasons that it is so is because we get to work with extraordinary people like Damon Fordham. Damon has been working with us, giving his Law Stories of Black Charleston tour out of the bookstore. Probably it was within, I think we've been open about a year when you started.
May of 2016.
May of 2016. So he was with us during that first year that we opened Buxton Books officially. Anyone who has followed the evolution, the continuing evolution of Buxton Books knows that it was a winding path to get to be the bookstore that we are right now. And when we look out and see all of these familiar and new faces in here who come here to share in the power of storytelling, to share in the power of words and community and conversation and learning, my heart overflows. And if you've been here before, I sometimes get very emotional when it is a book or a part of history or an author that resonates powerfully with me. And tonight it is all of those things. I am so honored to get to call Damon a colleague and a work partner, but to also call him a friend. He's an extraordinary human, and I am honored that he is a part of our team and that we get to collaborate and work together on the things that he does. I am going to read an official introduction because he deserves more than my heartfelt, emotional words, but at the same time, I do want to say that it is quite an extraordinary thing that we get to have this bookstore. And so this is my shameless plea to you tonight to buy a book. You don't have to buy a book. We know you can buy your books cheap and easy online, but when you buy a book from an independent bookseller, when you buy a book from Buxton Books, you are supporting that entire ecosystem of publishing and bookselling and reading. You are the lifeblood of that. It is how we let the publishers know that we want more stories from Damon Fordham. We want more books from Damon Fordham. When we sell books, his books, new books, because sometimes it's great to go to these sales where you buy a used book or you buy a like new one. I get it. I've been there, I've done it, I do it. But when you buy some of your books, when you think about buying a new book and giving it as a gift, that is how we get new books from authors like Damon Fordham. But it's also how we hear they go out and they say, oh, we want more books like this. And so that's where they start reaching out for similar stories and other authors and other stories that need to be told. And if there is nothing, almost everything I've learned from Damon with his teacher's heart is that the lost stories of Black Charleston is that these stories, there are so many stories that have not been told. The history that we learned in our history books growing up right here in Charleston, it was like Swiss cheese at best. So we know that there are some big gaping holes, and historians and authors like Damon are filling those holes every day with with his brain, with his brilliance, with his heart, and with his honor. There's so many stories I could tell, but one of them is that Damon just has a teacher's heart. They all come together. And it's not that there are no stupid questions, because there are plenty of stupid questions out there. We have heard, Damon has heard all of them, I believe. But when I have gotten used to and still do sometimes, get super angry or embarrassed by I've heard comments and questions that people ask, Damon always says, now hold on, Polly. And he proceeds to reframe that question and how I can take it, and he is able to, and he doesn't spin it into something better. He truly crafts it into a learning experience. Not only
I have my limits.
reach those limits very quickly. I will say that Damon puts his limits are something to be strived for, and something that we can all try to have our limits as high as Damon Fordham's are. And I haven't seen the limits yet. Tonight we are here on the eve of the publication of his fourth book, the 1885 Segregation Fight in South Carolina. It's out. We're very excited that this book is out, and it's a labor of a lot of love. He's done a lot of research that has gone into this. I am going to read Damon's official bio, which is, for any of you who do not know, Damon is a native of South Carolina. He received his master's degree in history from the College of Charleston, the Citadel. He's an undergraduate. His undergraduate degree was from the University of South Carolina in Columbia. He is a noted public speaker and educator. He has been a professor of United States and African American history and world history, I'll add that, as an adjunct professor at the Charleston Southern University, the Citadel, and the College of Charleston. He leads the Law Stories of Black Charleston walking tour that is his own creation and leaves from the bookstore and brings tourists and locals alike to some of the most significant sites in Charleston's African American history. Before today, Damon was the author of 3 previous books, Mr. Potts and Me, Voices of Black South Carolina, Legend and Legacy, and True Stories of Black South Carolina. We have a hard time keeping those on our shelves. And
what a problem to have.
What a problem to have. With the release of his newest title, the 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina, which we are all here to celebrate today, Damon is officially the author of 4 amazing books and more to come. In 2020, Damon was recognized by the South Carolina House of Representatives for his work as an educator, author, historian, and community activist. And Julian and I had the privilege of being there for a delayed ceremony for that, but that was a very powerful thing to get to witness. And Damon comes from Damon's father was a very beloved educator himself.
That's one of his students right there.
Yeah, he was amazing. Just like his father,
He's amazing. Well, it is a powerful thing to get to witness as that legacy continues, and to watch Damon make this community, his community, our community, a better place. And so thank you, and join me in welcoming Professor Damon Fordham to talk about it. He's going to give a short lecture. We're going to have some questions and answers, and then we're going to invite you to continue the conversation. He'll personalize books, have a glass of wine or beer or lemonade or tea. We even have a cake because it is a book birthday tomorrow, and so we want to fully celebrate, and we're just so glad you're here. Thank you.
All right. Well, first of all, as she said, I basically collect stories like the average person collects stamps. And before I was an educator, I was a journalist. And before I was a journalist, as Miss Sally Collins out here can tell you, my dad loved to tell stories. And when I was a boy, I liked to listen to him and the other elders tell fascinating stories. And I was also a bookworm who was very bad in sports, and a lot of people thought was quite strange, as a matter of fact. They won't admit that to you today, but I can tell you that that's a fact. But when I was about 12 years old, I came across a book in the library, 2 books. One was called The Treasury of American Folklore by B.A. Botkin, and Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston. And Mules and Men had Zora Neale Hurston, the well-known African-American anthropologist. She went back to her hometown of Eatonville, Florida, and sat on the porch of a man named Joe Clark and collected all the folk tales of the people of that community. And so many of those folk tales were identical to the kind of things I heard from the elders in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. So that's kind of what led me on this path with both stories and history. Now to the book. So now to this book. By the way, it was 10 years ago today that my last book, Mr. Potts and Me, came out, and they had a celebration at this now defunct club called L.J. Hughes's Place up on Upper King Street. And incidentally, Miss Felicia Pringle, who was back there, she was present at that one too exactly 10 years ago. So that's why I had this special extra smile on my face to see her here for that occasion. Now, with that being said about the book. So, about 1997, I came across a book called Lift Every Voice, African American Oratory, that had this collection of speeches by black speakers from 1797 to 1901. Yeah, who but me reads things like that, right? But I came across this amazing speech by a man named Thomas Miller. Thomas Miller was the founding president of South Carolina State University, South Carolina's flagship historically black college and university. And he gave this powerful retort to the attempt by Benjamin Tillman, who was the architect of segregation in South Carolina. More about him in a little bit. And the reply was so eloquent that many years later, Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't know if I'm saying his name right or not, but I am? Oh, that's good. I was worried about that. But anyway, Ta-Nehisi Coates used the title of one of his books from that very speech called We Were 8 Years in Power. And I'll get to that a little bit later on. So I said, whoa, I never heard about this before. And then I dug further to find that when Tillman was making Jim Crow the law of South Carolina, these 6 brave African-American leaders, Thomas Miller, the founder of South Carolina State, the great legendary Robert Smalls, yes, that Robert Smalls, William J. Whipper, a lawyer who practiced on Broad Street in the first black law office in America back in the 1860s. Let's see, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, these 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown, South Carolina. These brave men risked injury, threats, and insult to go to Columbia to try to stop Tillman and the South Carolina legislature from making segregation the law of the state. And so I said, whoa! I went to the Caroliniana Library, my alma mater, the University of South Carolina, and dug up the Columbia State newspapers from that period. And in those days, they tended to print the addresses in total that people made at things like this. And I found this amazing story. And the irony of that is that when I was in the Caroliniana Library researching this, guess what was looking down on me? But a bust of Benjamin Ryan Tillman himself. And I looked up and I just smiled at that statue and I said, yeah, buddy, I'm going to fix you with this book. And so here it is. So now the story. The story begins in the period immediately after slavery in the Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era has been greatly misinterpreted. For those of you who don't know, it's the period between 1865 and 1877 when the federal government tried to reform the former Confederacy by passing 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th that said in 1865 that said that black people were black people were free. The 14th in 1868 that said that black people were citizens. And the 15th in 1870 that said that African Americans had the right to vote. So during that particular period, amazing things took place. In Louisiana, from 1872 and 1873, there was a black governor, first in America, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, who was the founder of Southern University, the largest black college in America. And he was preceded as lieutenant governor by a black man named Oscar J. Dunn, who died of natural causes in 1871. Here in South Carolina, there were 2 black lieutenant governors. Alonzo Jacob Ramsey, serving from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howell Gleaves, serving from 1872 to 1877. Richard Howell Gleaves, by the way, served under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses, making this the first time in American history that there was a Jewish governor and a black governor. And by the way, our Julian Buxton, the manager of this bookstore, his father, in fact, did a paper on Governor Franklin Jacob Moses, as a matter of fact. Now, So during this period, they gathered at what is now the J. Waties Waring Judicial Center, which was known as the Charleston Clubhouse. And from January to April of 1868, they made this progressive constitution that had never been seen in America before. They called for anti-discrimination laws. Women would have the right to divorce abusive husbands. There would be state hospitals and mental institutions. No one would be imprisoned for debt. And on January the 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls, who was known for sneaking his family aboard the Confederate ship, the Planter, and off into freedom, Robert Smalls would, yes, please. Yes, please have a seat. Thank you. I don't want you to be uncomfortable. Anyway, so the great Robert Smalls, on January the 23rd, 1868, got up in what is now the J. Waties Waring Judicial Center and stated, resolved, all children between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under the penalty of noncompliance. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the first public school law in this part below the Mason-Dixon line. And also between 1873 and 1877, my alma mater, the University of South Carolina, became the first and only racially and sexually desegregated school anywhere in the South during the 1800s. They had the first black professor, Richard T. Greener, whose statue is now next to the Caroliniana Library. One of their graduates was Celia Dial Saxton, who was born in slavery in 1852, but died at her desk grading papers at the age of 88 in 1935, and recently a dormitory was named after her. Now, two things usually come up when these facts come about. Why haven't I heard this before? Here's why. The traditional South Carolina history book, History of South Carolina by Mary Sims Oliphant, that was used in South Carolina classrooms from 1917 to 1984, said this about this period. More than half of the members of the legislature were Negroes, and most of these could neither read or write. They spent nearly all of their time in the legislature in stealing the money of the people. Thousands and thousands of dollars were taken by these black thieves. Neither the property or the lives of white people were safe anywhere in the state. It must be realized that the state had a tremendous problem to face in the sudden liberation of irresponsible, uneducated, immoral, and brutish Africans. Need I say more? You see, most people only know what they are told. And that is what the majority of people were told. Why? Because in the early 1900s, the Daughters of the Confederacy under Mildred Rutherford down in Georgia made sure they oversaw the use of textbooks throughout the southern states. And this was the only kind of material that they approved. So that's why so few people know about this today. And that, in turn, plays a part of that. One of the main things behind segregation and slavery in the first place, and Jefferson Davis admitted this when he was a senator back in 1859 before the Confederacy, that the South wanted a permanent class of cheap labor among the black population and unity between the poor whites and the wealthy whites so that the poor whites would not see through their squalor and suffering and join the blacks in revolution against the planters who were oppressing them both. It's not rocket science, right? But most people, of course, weren't taught that. So anyway, the problem with all of this was that the poor whites had been taught for so long that these people were their inferiors. And the wealthy class who ran the South did not want to see these events take place for the simple fact that it was undermining their permanent class of cheap labor. So they went to work on the poor whites. And you had men like Benjamin Ryan Tillman, who led mobs against this sort of thing. And the fatal blow was in December 24th, 1865, when 6 Confederate veterans gathered in Pulaski, Tennessee, to form the Resistance Army against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. Now you see where that came from, right? And this led to mass carnage throughout the South. Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre of 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre of 1874, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre of 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina, now North Augusta, Massacre of 1876, and right on Broad Street, November the 8th, 1876, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of Broad Street. You notice how I just said that? Blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of Broad Street. You see, many people today would have you believe that when all these things were going on, black people did nothing but pray and cower in their churches until Martin Luther King and Malcolm X came along. That is a lie. Black folks, whenever these things happened, they fought back and shot back. Only the problem was they were in often cases outnumbered and outgunned. It's important to know that. Hi, Liz, good to see you. It's my cousin Liz Maxwell over there. And so all of this eroded. All of this led to the erosion of these rights. In 1877, the federal government had enough of all the carnage in the South and the disobeying of the constitutional amendments. So the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. And you had a situation like this. In what was then Christchurch Parish, now known as 4 Mile Mount Pleasant, there was a man by the name of James Buchanan Maxwell. And they arrested a group of men who they accused of being bought off to vote while illiterate. And this Mr. Maxwell, he'd gone to the Avery Institute and gotten an education after he was born in Flat Rock, North Carolina, and the family came down here so he could be reunited with his relatives. So he was a notary public over there. And when the opposing lawyer asked him if he could read, he was shocked when he said, "I can read." And he kept repeating over, "I can read." And they're like, "Okay, see, we can't deal with this one. This one's a hot mess." Ladies and gentlemen, my cousin Elizabeth Maxwell, well, see, my mother was Pearl Maxwell, so this J.B. Maxwell was our great-grandfather. And one of our cousins found the trial transcript where that was, and that's in the book, just so you'll know. And we grew up hearing a version of this story. So anyway, all of this led to the erosion of African Americans' rights to vote. Until finally, Benjamin Tillman had been making a name of himself in the upstate for fighting for the rights of farmers. Okay, that's good. And he also helped to establish Clemson and Winthrop. Okay, that was good. Well, that was the extent of what was good. He decided to build his power base upon the bigotry of the poor whites and their refusal to have the equality of blacks because they felt that equality would put them at the bottom of society. So that was what he played on. So he narrowly lost the Senate election in 1894 and said, "Oh no, we're not having this again." Because see, that Hamburg massacre I was telling you about, he was one of the lead figures of that. The Sweetwater Sable Club, a Klan group that was shooting African Americans up in Hamburg. And he admitted that too. So he came upon this idea that they were going to have this state convention where they were going to overthrow the progressive 1868 Constitution and replace it with the Segregation Constitution. And by this time, African Americans were so disfranchised that this was in the Charleston News and Courier, August 28, 1892. A separate list of all Negro voters must be kept and returned with the poll list. Every Negro applying to vote must place a written statement by 10 white men who would swear that they know of their knowledge that such voters voted for Governor Wade Hampton in 1876 and have voted the Democratic ticket ever since. This statement must be placed in the ballot box by the managers. Voter suppression, 1892 style. Hello. So, the African Americans of South Carolina gathered, and they elected 6 representatives to go to Columbia to put a stop to this mess. Those 6 African Americans were the 6 men who I told you about a little bit earlier. And almost immediately, it was a hot mess. The Benjamin Tillman and the majority out there They freely used that. They freely used, in the words of Forrest Gump, boy, did he love that N-word, and this and that, until William Whipper had to put a protest to have that kind of thing stopped. They didn't listen, needless to say. But in the midst of all of this, these men gave some amazing flights of oratory. I'm just going to give you a few samples of this. Thomas Miller, the president of South Carolina, would soon find South Carolina State. He said this: why do they say the Negro must be disfranchised? Is it because he is lawless? No. Is it because he is riotous in the discharge of right of suffrage? No, they answer. Because his skin is black, he should not vote. Because his skin is black, he is inferior. Because he did not fight for the ballot, he should not have it. Because we are a conquered people and were conquered by the national government, in the name of the Negro, he shall not rule. Mr. President, these are some of the reasons given those who swear by the altar of liberty that we shall not be citizens. Why is this? We must remember that the first universal struggle was the Revolutionary War against British oppression, and the first drop of blood that was spilt in that struggle was shed on Boston's Commons by a Negro slave, Crispus Attucks. In that conflict, he and 3 white patriots gave up their lives for that priceless liberty to which we now enjoy. The day when the white men of Massachusetts buried these heroes in one and the same and united common grave with that patriotic Negro, the status of the Negro in America was irrevocably fixed, sirs. For 75 years after that, the wheel of progress toward the universal rights of all was stopped, and the cause of Negro was hopeless. But justice, like a volcano fire, may sleep suppressed a while, but cannot expire. Deep, huh? And along with this, Robert Smalls. They had a debate on making interracial marriage illegal in South Carolina on that Constitution, Section 34. And Robert Smalls got up, the great Robert Smalls, and said that, okay, if you want to make it illegal for blacks and whites to marry, that's fine. But he threw a caveat in it. He said, all right, make it illegal, but also make it illegal for white men to have black concubines on the side and have children from them at the same time. The convention went nuts. I should add something to this, by the way. Ben Tillman's lawyer was a guy named William Thurman, father of J. Strom Thurman, father of my dad's college classmate at South Carolina State, at South Carolina State University in 1948, lady by the name of Essie Mae Washington. Y'all know the story, right? Yep. Need I say more? Needless to say, they kind of ignored that and passed it anyway. And it was not until 1998 that was taken out of our state constitution by a popular vote of 62 to 38. Something to think about, right? So anyway, among other things, William J. Whipper got up during this convention and said these words: This convention is about to make a grave mistake in not giving the Negro latitude. The car of Negro progress is coming, and instead of allowing it to come on, you wish to stop it. You may as well just make up your minds that the Negro will rise. He will not be crushed. The Negro will rise sooner or later, crush us as you may. The Negro, with our preservation, our pluck, will and must come out. We cannot be kept down forever, for it is not the nature of human affairs. And the address of these great speakers was cataloged in a couple of pamphlets at that time. But for a long time, though, a lot of these pamphlets were hard to find. One of them was written by Sarah Smalls, the daughter of Robert Smalls. And she had to say this: Indeed, it may have been an abject lesson by the all-wise God to teach the haughty, boastful sons of Carolina that there are Negroes capable and amply qualified in every respect to protect themselves whenever it becomes necessary to do so. That these few representatives of our race were but a small part of the rising hopes that time and education are bringing forward day to day in spite of lynching, in spite of caste prejudice, and any methods used against them. Whoa. And this got so deep on a national level that Booker T. Washington who is often wrongly portrayed as a milquetoast weakling against segregation, Booker T. Washington said these prophetic words directly to Benjamin Tillman during this. You, honored senator, are a student of history. Has there ever been a race that was helped by ignorance? Has there ever been a race that was harmed by intelligence? It is agreed by some that the Negro schools should be practically closed because we cannot bear our proportion to the burden of taxation. Will capital and immigration be attracted to a state where 3 out of 4 are ignorant and where poverty and crime abound? Honored sir, don't misunderstand me. I am not so selfish as to make this appeal to you in the interest of my race alone. For thank God a white man is near to my heart as a black man. I appeal to you in the interest of humanity. For whatsoever a man soweth, that he shall also reap. That turned out to be prophecy, ladies and gentlemen, because the state spent so much of its resources on keeping the half of its population submerged that this led to the high rates of illiteracy and crime and all of these other ills. Because as Booker T. Washington himself said, some years later in 1909 in the book, The Story of the Negro, you cannot hold a man in the ditch without getting dirty yourself. And that's what happened with South Carolina. And that is why South Carolina is in the position that it is today. And it's important to understand that because you see, people, you cannot find the cure of a problem until you know its cause. So they claimed him to a vote, and you can guess what the vote was. But there's some other twists and turns in this story that I'm going to save for you to read in the book, because the ending of this is really quite touching on how it ends, I might add, as to what happened with these men. But these men and the women who wrote their stories, there was also Mary Miller, who wrote down the speeches of her. Actually, in the book, I said that Mary Miller was Thomas Miller's wife, but she was actually his daughter. I found that out sort of after the fact, so I'm giving you the correction of that right now. But those men and women together who sought to preserve the story and give these wise words and all that, these people stand as a lesson for us today on a number of levels. You see, think about this for a moment. With Benjamin Tillman, you had this foul man with a foul mouth and foul ideas who bragged on the Senate floor of killing African Americans in order to maintain white supremacy. The people knew that he was a foul man who actually boxed another senator on the U.S. Senate floor in the face, in the middle of the Senate and all of that. They knew he was foul and they kept re-electing him. Sound familiar? Hello? Okay. And yet, even when he was proven to be foul, these people continued to follow him. Why? Because he played to the ignorant voters of his time and made the ignorant voters feel like they were somebody, but what he was giving them was emotional and artificial and not greatly in substance. Sound familiar? Hello? So you see, this is so important to now for many reasons. Because not only do you see the living example of what Jorge Santayana said in 1896 at Harvard about those not remembering the past being condemned to repeat it. Hello. But you see, right now, we have to face reality about a certain fact. Right now, our country is lacking in direction. A lot of people, just quite frankly, do not know what to do about the ills of this time and are seeking answers in the wrong places, and we have a lot of confusion. But here's how all this plays into being. There was a country 2,000 years ago that had what was called the Warring States period, where the people figured out how to make their own daggers and swords. Crime rose. Warlords were taking the country over. The country was in a mass confusion. A wise teacher went back to the teachings of the elders of that nation, who preached the wisdom that could not be found during his own time. And he went from king to king in this kingdom, preaching these wise teachings, hoping that these would set them on the right path to rule better. But each time they were like, what good is this going to do us? And they laughed in his face. And this teacher went to his grave feeling that he had wasted his life in trying to reform his nation through the wise teachings of those who came before them. Well, it turned out that the young students of his time also were listening. And when this great wise teacher died, they came together and put his wise teachings together. And soon, within a couple of generations after his death, his teachings became part of the main curriculum of that country for over 2,000 years. Here I am speaking of the great Confucius of China. And you see what the teachings of Confucius did for China. So right now we're in a situation where, as Martin Luther King predicted in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, in 1967, about answers that don't answer, solutions that don't solve, and explanations that don't explain. That's kind of where we are right now. But I really believe that if those of us who know of the wise teachings of those who came before us take those teachings, put them out before the general public in language that they could understand, and that the people who get this stuff work to tweak these teachings so that they are effective to our modern times and put them to modern use, then I think that that would be something approaching a real solution to avoid us from becoming ancient Rome 2 in the theater near you and truly becoming America the Beautiful. Thank you. So now that I said all that, do you have any questions? Yes.
David, this is a pedestrian question next to your freedom inspiring talk. What is the difference between Hampton's bed shirts and Tillman's terrorists?
None.
Okay.
Tillman was a red shirt, as a matter of fact. For those of you who don't know what he's talking about, Wade Hampton, who was the governor that overturned Reconstruction in South Carolina in 1876, he passed himself off as a political moderate, you see. He said that he didn't want to stop black people from voting, but he wanted black people to vote with him. But there was Martin W. Gary, who had a group called the Red Shirts that was using terrorism against the black politicians and white sympathizers of that time, you see. And Hampton did very little and nothing to stop them. And Tillman was a member of a branch of the Red Shirts called the Sweetwater Sable Club. These are all Klan offshoots. And they led to a lot of slaughter in South Carolina during that period. And again, Tillman did not disguise any of this. He openly bragged about this on the Senate floor. So that was that situation. Yes, Randy?
I've always been curious about, as you know, I'm not a historian, about whether this time period, 1897, and this same time period you're talking about, was the genesis of using the South Carolina Constitution as the litmus for the literacy test.
Let me answer that. Actually, we weren't the first to do that. One of the things that I didn't mention in the talk for purposes of time is that South Carolina got the idea of doing all of this from the Mississippi counterpart to Ben Tillman, a man by the name of James K. Vardaman. Okay, in 1890 in Mississippi, he came up with the Mississippi Plan. And the point of the Mississippi Plan was to get around the 15th Amendment by having the literacy clause, which basically said that you could vote if you went to the registrar, and the registrar agreed that you were literate enough to vote. However, what would happen was this. If you went to the registrar to vote and you were white and you were illiterate, you went up there, excuse me, but I would like to cast my vote. Okay, go right ahead. And if an African American came up and went, greetings, I am Hubert P. Stonewallow of Harvard University, and I would like to take part in the elective branch. All right, boy, all right. Can you tell me the preamble to the Constitution of the United States? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, established justice. All right. Can you tell me the Gettysburg Address? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon our continent a new. All right, all right, all right. Then he would take something in Chinese and held him. Now, can you read this, boy? And he said, yes, it means you don't want me to vote. That's kind of how they would roll. In other words, they would basically accept any illiterate white voter, but disqualify literate black voters. And there's some very direct references to this in the book.
I was always struck by the irony of using the state constitution, weaponizing it as a device for denying people the right to vote.
But see, here's the thing. The law, as we have seen in recent times, the laws are only good as their enforcement. You can have the law, but you see, unless you have an informed public voting on a vigilant and constant basis, the people up top will do whatever they want with the law. Because the fact of the matter is, all of this, as it was later proved in Brown versus Board and the later Civil Rights Acts and all that, this was a gross violation of the Constitution. The problem was that the people in Washington did not care. They turned their head as all of these things were allowed, and they allowed these things to happen until African Americans and white allies got together, and they embarrassed the world by showing through television and things like that how they were grossly violating the rights of many of their citizens, and that world pressure, after seeing all these things like Birmingham and Selma and things like that, that told the, and plus you had these newly freed African Americans, African nations that were basically deciding between us and the communists. Well, that's when John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson said, you know, we must act, and this is a moral issue, and that's what helped make changes. Yes, I hope that helped, Randy. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Putting in context, I grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
Well, all right.
Always knew of S.C. Washington, always knew of Miller.
Mm-hmm.
Chose to attend Winthrop because they were heavily recruited in the late 70s, trying to build up the minority population. And as we matriculated through, the Tillman building, very much so significant, and my friends went to Clemson, the Tillman building.
Yeah!
And the clock and all of that.
Yeah!
The buildings. So over time, the story of Chilton, because that was certainly not a part of our history tour of Winthrop, but you need to know to attend, it's not a part of the narrative. You know, as the conversations about removing names of buildings, removing monuments, and so forth, that conversation about Chilton has come up and was flushed, as far as removing them from Winthrop and Clemson. So has that conversation, does it still follow political leaders, or would it squash it every time?
No, what happens is this. We are in a very historically illiterate state, by and large. And so not enough people really know about Tillman, because very few people read old newspapers and old journals and that sort of thing. And you have to sort of get an informed public before you can do anything like that, you see. So basically now, personally, I'm of the opinion where I'm more about erecting monuments to those brave heroes that are in this book than anything else. That's what I would really like to see, because I think that the education of that needs to offset that. And if anything, you know, whether they keep the Tillman name and all that, my thing is that, all right, if they want to keep it, tell the truth about who and what he was, and let the chips fall where they may. See, that's my main thing about that. Now, granted, in most cases, that's not something that I usually care about, but Tillman himself was just so extreme and so foul that to put something like that in a place of honor, that's obscenity. But interestingly enough, though, are you familiar with the monument that's on Senate Street, right around the corner from where Tillman is, at the State House? There are two monuments there. There's an African American monument that's over by the other side of where Tillman is, right? And that was done by Ed Dwight. Ed Dwight was picked by John F. Kennedy to be the first black astronaut. But Chuck Yeager, the guy who broke the sound barrier, said that there was no way he was going to let that be an astronaut, right? But so Ed Dwight became a sculptor, and you see that that turned out to be a blessing in disguise. He has the African American monument. But around the corner from all of that is the statue of Narcisco Gonzalez. Narcisco Gonzalez wrote against Tillman and his nephew Jim Tillman, and in 1903, Jim Tillman called Narcisco Gonzalez a dirty Spaniard and shot him dead in the middle of Senate Street. And today there's a monument to Narcisco Gonzalez on Senate Street right around the corner from the State House. I'd like to see more of that.
I have a quick comment and then a question. This is about about your Facebook page. Someone went on your Facebook page and said, "Why don't you run for office?" And I put an answer on there that to get the right politicians and the right people in office, you have to have the right thinking among the people, and that's what you're doing.
Well, thank you, because my usual stock answer to that question, and I'm sort of flattered that I get it often, is that I'm a scholar and not a political official, and the only thing I'm running for is my health. But let me say this about that, though. Yeah, you see, we all have to know our roles in this thing. Not, Julian Bond, the civil rights leader back in the day, who I had the pleasure of meeting along with my good friend Patika Robinson back there. He once said something that pretty much sums a lot of that up. He once said, "Look at that gal, shake that thing. Everybody can't be Martin Luther King." So you got to kind of know your role in all of this. And I see my role as a public scholar who informs the public of these things. So that kind of goes into what you just said, is to where, because see, a lot of academics can't communicate with the people quite well because they're so hung up on, this academic language that sounds like gibberish to the average person. See, I don't believe in any of that. I believe in using plain language to plain everyday people because they're the ones that need this stuff. So this is where I see my role as an interpreter of these things to the average person, and then they can take all of that and move forward.
My question is, I know historians don't like what-if questions and alternate facts, but I'm going to ask you this anyway.
Okay, sure.
What would have happened if Wade Hampton and Samuel L. Chilton had both won the election in 1876?
Well, Hampton did win the election.
But Chilton didn't.
Right. But see, it would have been pretty much the same thing or worse, because that would have put the renegade, that group of Democrats in power, and you know what that would have meant to the African American. Pure disaster. In other words, back then we were between a rock and a hard place, pretty much. Because you have to remember that all of this was done some 5, 6, and 7 years, up to 11 years after slavery. And while you had a small educated class of people like the Thomas Millers and the Robert Smalls and people like that, while there were a lot of them, the people that they represented at that time, there were very few people who had that power to be able to come together to be a force against those folks at that time period, you see. So it was a case of being outnumbered and outgunned more than anything else. Plus, these people also controlled public opinion at that time. And they turned the public opinion against the South by things like what I just read to you about what Mary Sims Oliphant said, you see. They controlled the narrative. So all of that worked against the African American during that time. Yes, Margaret, you're about to say something.
Thank you, Damon. I just want to say that when I got this book last week, I realized what you were doing was shining a light on history that has been set aside
and suppressed.
And I studied Mary Oliphant Sims' book, so I actually have a copy of it now. And so I just want to tell you how much I appreciate this, and I want to try and support you in this and trying to figure out who are the audiences that we need to make sure see this. And then I just have one question.
Sure.
Why was it there were 154 white people and only 6 black people in the convention?
Very simple. It goes back to what I said with that whole voter suppression thing. The pro-Confederate types can manage to have their narrative that black people were ignorant and ruining the state with all the evidence to the contrary. And by the way, the contrary evidence can be found in the minutes of the 1868 Constitutional Convention, which are at the South Carolina room over at the Charleston County Library as well as the State Archives, right? So they spun this narrative for their own purposes, that we were ignorant, that we were ruining the state. And if you ever see a movie called Birth of a Nation from 1915, that's the cinema version of all of this. That narrative is what took hold during that time period, in spite of the efforts of people like Robert Smalls and Thomas Northern. Because you have to remember now, in those days, they were, I don't think there were even 10 million African Americans at that time. So we were basically at the mercy of that majority during that period, even though many of us fought back during these things. So basically, since we were not in control of the national media and the narrative, that allowed them to reduce the vote of black people in South Carolina to where it did. And remember now, a lot of African Americans were still illiterate during this period.
So the allotment was based on the number of registered voters?
Correct.
Oh, God.
Yes. Hi, Donna.
Hi.
Go ahead, Walter.
I remember a few years ago, Mark Sanford wrote an editorial. Oh, you remember this one, right?
No, but go ahead.
Okay, no. I can see the smile. He wrote this editorial published in the Boston Courier, and the headline read something like that the 1895 Constitution was written in fear of a black governor of South Carolina, because the majority of the population of the state of South Carolina was black,
Right.
and historically was even blacker historically than even Mississippi.
Right. That's true, but again, that black majority, the people who had power and the education and the control of the media were few at that time. So therefore, that's why that happened. And it's not through their own fault, because again, they did organize, and as a matter of fact, I don't know if you're familiar with Bishop Henry Mcneil Turner. But Bishop Henry Mcneil Turner was sort of like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey before Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey, okay? And he had this to say during the same period regarding Tillman and all of that. 1897, he's the Bishop of the African American Episcopal Church. Let every Negro in this country with the spark of manhood in him supply his house with 1, 2, or 3 guns, with a 6 or 7 shooter, and we advise him to keep them loaded and ready for immediate use, and when his domicile is invaded by bloody lynchers or any other mob by day or night, Sabbath or weekday, turn you loose your missiles of death and blow the fiendish invaders into 1,000 giblets. So these people weren't playing.
Right?
You see? But again, history does not record this. And right now, you have these people who write these histories to make it seem as if we were nothing but victims and objects of pity during this period. We were anything but. It's just that unfortunately, the tide and the numbers were not on our side, and it was not for lack of trying, and that's the key thing, because if people go along with this narrative that we were these weak victims of pity during this period, that would give the young people no hope. And with no hope, you do not fight for anything better if you don't have hope. So that is why this kind of thing is so important. Because as Malcolm X correctly said, you can never do anything if you don't believe you did anything. And I should also add this too, as a somewhat of a spoiler note. These folks actually convinced 2 of the white delegates, T.E. Dudley from Marlboro, South Carolina, and John Halston Reed from Georgetown. They actually joined the black delegates in voting against this new convention because their arguments were that strong. That's right. So therefore, that's not to say, because so many of these people today, they don't know history. They think that basically it was a case of all the white people were against us and the blacks were weak and powerless and did nothing. Things like this are an attempt to change that narrative. Anything else?
Well, I want to say thank you and ask you all to continue the conversation and stay. And in Damon's introduction here, he says that a time when inspiring and insightful oratory and clarity is rare. It is hoped that the publication of these speeches, this book, will inspire higher standards of public discourse for
Yes.
future generations,
Yes.
as well as solutions for the issues covered that remain in current generations. And I say we're on the way. This is just a beginning. Thank you, Damon.
Oh, wait. One other thing I have to say as far as that goes, too. This is also from the introduction. Think about this. It gives one pause to realize that some of the events of the 21st century have proven that while public sentiment does not always align with what rational minds would consider as sensible, and in this aspect, the enclosed story may serve as a cautionary tale of what happens when public figures place political expediency over what they know to be correct. Did I say more?
No.
Mic
All right.
drop. Mic drop. Purchase a book. Stay and continue the conversation. Damon will be signing and personalizing. If you think later, if you're watching online, you can purchase them online or call the bookstore and come go on one of Damon's Lost Stories of Black Charleston tour if you have not done it, or if you've done it, come again because it is always evolving. He has incorporated parts of his recent trip to Africa into his tour, and he's
Yes,
really
Sierra
just
Leone and Gambia.
When
It
is it
is-
offered? When are the tours offered?
daily here.
What time?
Not on Sundays, but they are most they're all around his teaching and lecturing
Where
schedule.
are we getting the
But
schedule?
the most online, or you can call the store. But they're usually 3:30 in the afternoon and 10 a.m. on Saturday mornings. That's the current schedule. But it all is based around his teaching schedule and his lecturing schedule. So, but that is some time well spent.
1.5 to 2 hours.
Yeah.
And incidentally, I'm basically teaching in the mornings, and I do this in the afternoons, except for Saturday. I do it on 10 to 12 on Saturday mornings.
It's wonderful. Thank you, David.
You're welcome.